Hello, my name's Gavin, this is Genre Books, and today's video is just a bit of a wrap up. It's a wrap up for June. There's a small book haul involved and a wrap up for the first half year, as I'm also rolling into the mid-year freak out tag. The main event for June was, of course, June on the Range, the BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, where we dive into all things Western. As well as 8 Western novels, I also read a Western comic, 2 Western magazines, and watched a couple of movies as well. In terms of videos, I continued my 50 Zanes of Grey, not only with a review of The Heritage of the Desert, but also looking at some of the films with the Zane Grey name attached to them, the TV series and the magazines, and that included watching 2 film versions of The Heritage of the Desert. I also recorded a video discussing the Oregon Trail with Greg from Ghost Readers in the Sky, which is something I read at the end of May but was released in June, and I put the June on the Range branding on this. I also had a Project Gutenberg video where I suggested a number of different Western short stories available on that fantastic resource. I am recording this a couple of days before the end of June, and I'm still in the middle of Jubal Sackett by Louis L'Amour. This will be my last Western for the month. This is the 4th book in his Sackett series. In terms of the Western books read, I've already released a video on the Piccadilly Cowboys books that I read. That was California Killing by George G. Gilman, aka Terry Harkness, and The Killing Trail by Charles R. Pike, the first Jubal Cade book. Charles R. Pike, also aka Terry Harkness. I also read The Lonely Hunt, the first of the Breed Westerns, and River of Blood, the second of the Herne the Hunter series. Zane Grey was a given, so I read Heritage of the Desert. I also did a buddy read of my first ever Clarence E. Mulford. This was Hopalong Cassidy, which I buddy read with Roy from Roy Reads Anything. I quite enjoyed Hopalong Cassidy. I had been under the misapprehension that this was sort of a Western character for children. I think this is because of comics, magazines, the TV series, and some of the films which do play down a lot of the more serious and violent themes in the book. There's a bit of racism in Hopalong Cassidy, specifically anti-Mexican sentiment, which spoils the book to an extent. There's also a very protracted gun battle which takes up, must be nearly 100 pages at the end, which is difficult to keep the tension going for that length of time. But the story itself is solid, and the romance, whilst wrapped up quite quickly, is handled nicely. Possibly a little better than all of the romances, for want of a better word, in spicy Western stories, which I also did a video of. Not every single Western was a surefire winner for me. I read Al Cody's The Renegade, which I was quite looking forward to. The book looks fantastic. The name is one that I had recognised, but I had not read his work before. I found it a little bit unengaging and jarring. Sometimes I couldn't quite figure out how the leap had been made from one particular plot point to the next. There's flashes of good stuff here, but overall didn't quite enjoy this one, certainly as much as I was hoping to. This year I finally gave in And as I now had a few Star Trek books, joined in my first book trek. The one I read this month was Dreams of the Raven by Carmen Carter. And yeah, I think I enjoyed this more than I was expecting to. So it made up a little for the Renegade. It is, as you can see, original series time and involved McCoy as the main character. So I knew I was going to like this. As this is my first ever Star Trek novel, I was a little bit in trepidation as to whether I would enjoy it as much. I like the fact that some of the lesser characters from the series are name checked and featured a little more prominently than they otherwise would do, notably Nurse Chapel, but also Mr. Kyle, who always seems to get forgotten. I shall be coming back to more Star Trek during the rest of this summer, although I'm limiting myself to one book per month. It was also the beginning in June of the Summer of Sport, and I took the opportunity to do my first ever Poetry Thursday video. Some cricket poetry, everybody from A.E. Houseman to Harold Pinter. I may return to more cricket poetry during the summer. I will see how I feel. But also for the Summer of Sport, I did a video just released yesterday for me, nearly a week ago by the time this comes out. The cricket team, which was made up entirely of writers and illustrators. The brief history of cricket in literature, and then a look at that team lineup, which included, during its years of operation, Arthur Conan Doyle, P.G. Wodehouse, Jerome K. Jerome, E.W. Hornung, Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, and put together by Peter Pan's creator J.M. Barrie. It's also the Summer of Steinbeck, an event I am happy to be taking part in, and I can't have the time to read as much Steinbeck as other members of the group, but I did manage to squeeze in quite a chunky book, The Grapes of Wrath. This is a rare reread for me, although I last read this when I was a teenager, and reading it as an adult is an entirely different experience. This is just a great book. I don't think I'm adding much to the discourse by saying that, other than voicing my support for the general conclusion. By reading The Grapes of Wrath, I am, by default, also taking part in the Big Book Summer event. There were a couple of other big books that I read or finished during June. The first volume of my 4-volume set of The 1,000 Nights and One Night, definitely more than 400 pages, and I had a live discussion with James at Quaint and Curious Volumes about the last set of nights we were reading for this ongoing 18-month and more event. And another big book, and part of the New Futurians event, I read another reread, so 2 in a month. That's quite an achievement for me. And again, a book I last read when I was a teenager, Ian M. Banks' Consider Phlebas, the first of his culture novels, and the first of his culture novels to have a title taken from The Wasteland. This book is a bit more of a space opera than I remember it being, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. It has a high body count and a bleak ending, but the scope on display here and the breadth of new ideas is quite breathtaking. During June, I also joined Duncan at Back Away from the Donkey over on his channel for a discussion. It was pretty much a free-ranging discussion. I think in future months, because I will be doing this, I think, monthly, we may have something a little more structured. But this was more of a Finding Our Feet episode. Duncan's been running this series for a while. His co-host, Big Al Does Booktube, is taking a bit of a break from Booktube, and I'm plugging a gap. I also, in the past week, got a little bit of a head start on a July Booktube event, Jane Austen July, hosts of which linked below. But I read, for the first time, Persuasion, and I enjoyed it immensely. I also, on the advice of my wife, looked at this book, which is the last two and a bit chapters of Persuasion, the original ones that Jane Austen wrote, before replacing them with what we know in the text, which was illuminating. I will be doing a proper video on this book, hopefully some point in July. I also watched a movie adaptation. So this wasn't my first Jane Austen book I've read. I had read Mansfield Park in the dim and distant past, but I certainly enjoyed this one more, and it is definitely the first Jane Austen screen adaptation I've ever seen too. So breaking new ground. In terms of books acquired during the month of June, not a huge pile, but I want to show them off anyway. Patricia McKillip's The Riddle Master of Head. So this is the first book in a trilogy, which I already owned the second volume of, so just one more to go. A 60-year-old paperback, a Brian Aldiss collection of short stories, The Heirs of Earth, from a 1965 edition of a 1963 collection. And another science fiction anthology, this time Out of This World, volume 7 from 1968, edited by Mabley Owen and by Annabel Clough Williams. So Annabel Clough Williams was the wife of, I think it's Ellis Clough Williams, who was the architect who designed Port Miriam in North Wales. She was also a member of the Bloomsbury set in her younger years, but had a sideline in editing an awful lot of volumes of science fiction and fairy stories and folklore and what have you. This particular volume has C.C. McCapp, Robert Heinlein, Howard Fast, Joseph P. Martino, John Wyndham, Robert Sheckley, Martin Lauren and Robert Silverberg, so a mix of familiar and unfamiliar names. From a supermarket and their charity bookshelf, I also picked up, for pennies, The Lord of Lords, an account of the life of Lord Frederick Beauclerk, a cricketer from the early 19th century, who a bit of a character all round. A vicar by profession, cricketer by instinct, descendant of Charles II and Nell Gwyn, and all round character. And finally, during June, it was also Father's Day, and as well as being given a Waterstones voucher, so I can buy any book that I want, sort of, one that Waterstones has, I was also given from the British Library Tales of the Weird collection, Spores of Doom, Tales of the Fungal Weird. Stories here include ones by Sylvia Plath, William Hope Hodgson, Edgar Allan Poe, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Lovecraft, H.G. Wells, E.F. Benson, Clark Ashton Smith and Robert Aikman. Definitely one to be dipping into towards the end of the year. But the end of the year is still some way away. This is resolutely the middle of the year, and I've seen a few people do this tag, so I'll join in. It's the mid-year freakout. Best book of the year you've read so far. Honourable mentions, I think, for a book that surprised me, Late Final by Lewis Gibbs, a post-apocalyptic, quite harrowing book in its way. And The Rose of Tibet by Lionel Davidson. a rip-roaring adventure, which a lot better than I had expected it to be. But sticking with Tibet, and I know I'll bang on about this book, but it is because it's been the best book of the year that I have read so far. It's James Hilton's Lost Horizon. I covered this in its own video, but I would recommend this book to absolutely anybody. I loved it. Prompt number 2, the best sequel you've read so far. There's been a few, notably because I was reading some fantasy books during February, and fantasy loves a sequel. Also some science fiction. So The Patchwork Girl by Larry Niven was a book I was not expecting to be a sequel. It features the detective Gil Hamilton, and I had read the first Gil Hamilton book last year. I did not know that book had a sequel and until I started reading The Patchwork Girl. One I definitely did know was a sequel, Gardner F. Fox, The Thief of Larn. Lovely, pulpy, trashy adventure in very much the Burroughs Barsoom mould. And Patricia A. McKillip's The Moon and the Face, which I read directly after the first book in that series. Both slim volumes, both highly enjoyable. And I would be remiss if I did not mention The Fabulous Riverboat by Philip Jose Farmer, as I have read nearly all the Riverworld series. Just one to go. This was the second volume in that series. The best sequel I have read this year so far, however, is The Spirit of the Border by Zane Grey, the second book in his Border trilogy following Betty Zane. So this is... Betty Zane was more of a historical, embellished but historical. Spirit of the Border takes real life people but gives a little bit more artistic license to the events. And being allowed to give his imagination free rein, I did enjoy this book more than the original, which is not always the case for a sequel. Prompt number 3, new release that you haven't read yet but you want to. I'm being cheeky, this is not a new release, but it's new to Gutenberg. I have, in the last month or so, started doing a series of shorts about books that have just arrived onto the Project Gutenberg platform, and when I saw this one, my eyes widened. I did not know it existed. Gilbert Collins' Valley of Eyes Unseen. Having recently read Lost Horizon, I was surprised that this book seems to have the same basic setup, but released a decade earlier. So I'll be interested to get to that one and make a comparison. Prompt number 4, most anticipated release for the second half of the year. I don't follow book releases, I'm sorry. The book I'm most looking forward to reading is a continuation of 1001 Nights. So, being 1200 years old, it's not exactly a new release, but it's certainly new to me. And in this next volume, we will end up getting to read some Sinbad. Prompt number 5, biggest disappointment. Well, I've already mentioned The Renegade by Al Cody. That's not the biggest disappointment, but that was a bit of a disappointment. In terms of what the title promised and the book delivered, possibly Night of the Death Rain by Luan Ranzetta. That book, I'm afraid, was just a mess. Even that, though, was better than A Bit of Atlantis by Douglas Erskine. Possibly one of the worst books I've ever read. Fortunately, short enough that it didn't take me too long, but I wonder whether this writer had seen a novel before. There was no dialogue between the characters. I think I've covered this in a previous video, but I was just flabbergasted by how very not good this book was. As I knew nothing about it, however, could I call that a disappointment? In a way, although it's by far the best of the books I've just mentioned for this prompt, perhaps the biggest disappointment was The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers. There's a lot to like in that book, but it really did lack a bit of cohesion, a bit of punchiness, and the title is quite misleading. Enough negativity, however. Prompt number 6, biggest surprise. I've got 2 here, both women authors. One I nearly picked Agatha Christie. So I've only started reading Agatha Christie this year, and I had a whole series in March about books and their adaptations for essentially just Miss Marple. I've not yet got round to Tommy and Tuppence or Poirot. I have really enjoyed these books. They are quick, punchy, funny, inventive reads. But can I call it a surprise? Possibly not. I certainly enjoyed them more than I thought I was going to, but I knew that they were going to be good, given quite how popular they are. I think the biggest surprise was how much I enjoyed My Journey to Lhasa by Alexandra David Neal. And I was as much, if not more, impressed by the writer as I was by the book. Again, I've got a whole video on that. Prompt number 7, favourite new author, debut or new to you? So, unsurprisingly, it's James Hilton for Lost Horizon. Prompt number 8, newest fictional crush. I'm nearly 50. I don't have crushes. I certainly don't have them about imaginary people. I'm glad to say that it's definitely not a Stepford wife from the Stepford Wives, which I read last month, or any of the spicy girls from the spicy pulps I have been reading from March through to June. If you're going to make me pick somebody, it's Miss Lucy Honeychurch from Ian Forster's Room of a View, a book I first read this year, but possibly that crush element more to do with the fact that the film version with Helena Bonham Carter was released when I was at a very impressionable age. Prompt number 9, newest favourite character. Again, Miss Marple is close but no cigar, but I really do like Miss Marple. Joe Miller from the Riverworld books. He's not one of the main characters, but I really like the characterization, the input, and basically the backstory of some prehistoric, pre-Neanderthal man giant who over time has learned to almost civilize himself. But possibly my favourite newest character is a real person, and it's Alexandra David Neal. Again, I've linked that video below. I really was taken by her life story. Prompt number 10, book that made you cry. I don't think any book has made me cry this year. The closest definitely would be Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Prompt number 11, book that made you happy. 1001 Nights is just it's a mixture of absolutely uncomplicated storytelling with a real sense of wonder that you are so removed from this culture that some things are difficult to fathom, others take some digging into. So a very surface story with depths that are there to be explored should you wish. The Riverworld books. It is such a deep dive into this. They are massive in scope, a little bit rambly, but so interesting at every twist and turn. But again, I'm afraid it's going to be Lost Horizon. That's the book that made me truly happiest in reading it. Prompt number 12, the most beautiful book you've bought so far this year. Well, for the first 3.5 months of the year, that's quite easy. I didn't buy any books. I was still on the Read What You Own challenge. And I was in a bit of a rush to get to the end of the Read What You Own challenge because I had a holiday booked in Hay-on-Wye, where all that good work of the Read What You Own challenge went completely out of the window. And the books I've narrowed it down to were all bought on that week-long shopping trip. And I include this one because it's 2 books. And they were an absolute bargain, possibly the only massive bargain I got during my stay at Hay-on-Wye. But the Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2, both in Penguin, both the television show scripts. I'm missing one. This definitely would be the clear winner if I also had the Quatermass and the Pit that goes with it. But the prices are a little bit prohibitive. One day I will, because I think having the whole collection would boost value of the whole of them. Those Quatermass books were 1959 and 1960 respectively, so there just must be something in the water at that time, because the last book I'm choosing is from 1961. It's the Pan Giant First Thus edition of On the Road by Jack Kerouac. It just looks the business. I can't fault it. It's a little bit tatty, but for something 65, 64 years old, I'll let it off. Prompt number 13, the final prompt of the mid-year freakout. What books do you need to read by the end of the year? I don't need to read any. I want to read them all. So far this year, 96 books, which for half a year is not a bad return. I don't think I'm going to be able to match it in the second half of this year. I will give it a good try, obviously, but there is just far too much to get involved in. There'll be some more Jane Austen for Jane Austen July. Someone's gone and made a Private Eye July book event, so I'm going to have to read something for that as well. But the main event for me in July is Rocket Summer, so there's a lot of science fiction coming. I also have a science fiction project I'm gearing up for next year. That's going to need some reading. I'm continuing Project Rabbit Hole. I'm continuing 50 Zanes of Grey. We have Shake-Tember, so I've got to make some time for The Bard. We have Victober, so I've got to make some time for an awful lot of stuff. There is, of course, August. In August, God knows what I'm ending up reading there. The mix of plans and unknowns and surprises that will be sprung is joyous. But until next time, bye.